Tonight, we will be hearing from Michelle Grabner. She is a professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in the Painting and Drawing Department, as well as a founder and co-director of the Suburban and the Poor Farm, two independently run artist exhibition spaces. For over 30 years, Michelle has created pattern-based work in a variety of media, including drawing, painting, video, and sculpture, exploring themes such as domesticity and Midwest pragmatism. Grounded in process and productivity, Michelle has had a multifaceted career that combines her studio practice with the creative and community-based tasks of writing, curating, and teaching. She has also had solo exhibitions at the Indianapolis Museum of Art, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, Ulrich Museum, Wichita, and University Galleries, Illinois State University, as well as being included in numerous group exhibitions. Michelle also curated the 2016 Portland Biennial and served as co-curator of the 2014 Whitney Biennial. She is currently co-curator of the Front International Cleveland Triennial opening this summer. Additionally, we are pleased to announce that Michelle's new work will be featured in a group exhibition in this house, opening this Saturday in the McCormick House at the Elmhurst Art Museum. Please welcome Michelle Grabner.
I am delighted to be here. I've learned a lot from sitting in your seats. Over the years, many amazing artists have come through this hall. And learning is hard work, as we all know. Work itself is not difficult, but learning is hard. And one artist comes to mind, and that is Albert Olin. And I remember sitting in the audience when Albert was going through his paintings, and they were the 80s, they were from the 80s. And there was a painting that he talked about as having a whiff of critique. Just a whiff, mind you, and this was the 80s. And as I go through my work, I really challenge all of you to see the critical underpinning of all of it. It may look like pattern, it may look like a cliche, it may be too beautiful, it may be not beautiful enough, we may want to turn our back on it, but please know that all the activities that I'll talk about tonight really have an underlining current of criticality, really pushing at the politics, particularly of form. And I stand in front of you as a formalist, unabashedly a formalist, somebody who's interested in material as well. But remember, form's responsibility is to give order, and order is always political, right? So within repetition, within overlay, within composition, when one thinks about color, when one thinks about materiality, all of those things are challenging. You know, it's a bit ironic that I stand here because the best presentation is always a good story. And I have a really hard time giving a good story. I don't bring that into my work. It is just not part of the practice. I am not a research-based artist. I was just in New York with a group of SAIC students. We spent 2 weeks going around to studios, and we talked to an artist, a very good storyteller, an elegant storyteller named Naeem Mahmoudin. And he's extraordinary. And you know, I was talking to him also because I'm including him in this Front International, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But I want you to understand the kind of current of formalism. You know, formalism has been derided within the university for a very long time. It just hasn't been handled in an interesting way. When we talk about color, when we talk about composition, when we talk about surface, it often falls flat because in our world, there's really powerful things to talk about. Just remember that all of those things are signifiers for those same kind of power, right? Hierarchy is nothing but a kind of form and organization. I start out by showing you a painting that I'm really wrestling with right now, right here and now, because I'm about to make a pivot, I think a pivot in the studio. So I want to bring you in on that. And I spent a lot of time today in front of it, and every time I'm down here, I'll break away for a break from teaching and take a look at this Charles Demuth painting. It's in the American wing. Some of you may recognize it. Some of you may walk right by it. It's titled Spring from 1921. It's oil on canvas. And we know Charles Demuth is an American painter, often for his industrial landscapes. And here what we're looking at are swatches right? Little samplers, right? And I often get over the years of working that my work, my pattern deals with a kind of sample, right? It's not monumental enough. It has something, it's relegated to the crafts or to decoration or to the domestic. And this is a really interesting piece to me, again, because of its formal qualities, but I'm going to point something out here. So hopefully you've all seen it. The surface is fairly homogeneous. I'm trying to wrestle with the surface, and I'll tell you how I'm thinking about this piece. So look at what's going on here. There's kind of a truth and representation of how these things are scattered, laid out, but then look at the ground. Look at the figure-ground relationship. What's happening to that ground? It's highly abstracted. So there's a kind of reality in the cards themselves, in these fabric samples. But look at the detail on the right. The idea of veracity, the fact that he was observing very closely the patterns and recording the patterns, allowed him to, in this case, and it actually breaks the whole painting for me. And I have a little, hold on here, let's see if I can get this going. Nope, this is my, sorry about this, be patient. I'm looking for, oh, here it is. I'm just going to point it out here. So I want you to look at a little triangle, right? So the idea of overlapping, one sees little corners and so forth, but there is a tiny little corner. If you follow this gridded pattern up, you see that little corner, that he needed to include to create a kind of veracity, a realism of what he was observing. But let me ask you if that makes the better painting. What happened if that wasn't there? It would not foil the picture space, right? The space that's being created. But there's this need for truth, and that's what's so interesting about this painting. And think about that in the current condition that we're living in, right? The idea of truth, the idea of what is fake, what is false, but the idea of putting it forward, even in this case, I think at the risk of ruining the composition, or it's a thing that when you discover kind of tanks, right? You cannot stop seeing it once it's there. And I challenge you to go stand in front of it. So repetition, that which is domestic, thinking about abstraction, those are all things within my wheelhouse. And then now, I think some of you know that I've been making and working on these paper weavings for a very long time. They're a Froebel exercise. I'll talk briefly about Froebel in a little bit. So these paper weavings that you see patterning the wall in a grid, I'm about to make this move in painting them, right? Instead of making them, executing them, starting to think about composition, starting to think about overlay. What does that mean? Think about the hierarchies within that structure. How do I deal with figure-ground relationships? How do I deal with degrees of abstraction? How do I think about representation? Right? So all of these things are really coming into play. And I tell you, I'm standing up here really enthusiastic, been thinking about this for a long time. And I'm a very slow artist. Things change, little alterations happen through huge amounts of repetition, not only within the work itself, but within a series, per se. And those series last for very long periods of time. So now what I would like to do, now that I showed you where the focus is, I'm going to walk you through some of my influences, those people who are important to me, but also a handful of work, even walk you through some sculptural processes, and then I'll walk you also through some of the curatorial projects I'm working on. And I'm going to try to be just descriptive. There's a lot of images. It's going to be a little bit of a Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. And as I was saying earlier, when we talk about criticality, I'm really good in the Q&A. So I want to leave a lot of time for a back and forth. If I can kind of think on my feet, I think I'm at my best. So I'm going to give you a scope of work. And again, if we're talking about degrees of truth or degrees of fiction, you know, this is nothing but a fiction. A survey exhibition, nothing but a fiction. It cannot, color slides, language, cannot kind of convey the relationship that one has with a studio, with materials, and so forth. So I'll be as enthusiastic as I can. I hope I like this fiction that I built for you today. But we'll start with Froebel, Friedrich Froebel, somebody that I always default to, the German philosopher who invented the tenets of kindergarten, haptic learning. He created what he calls 13 gifts, these exercises that you encounter in kindergarten classrooms. Here's an example of one in which one understands centrifugal force, right? You come to understand the physics of the world that we live in through this exercise of color and twisting a weighted ball around a kid's finger, right? So you start thinking about these abstractions. We think about Montessori and her counting beads, starting to come to the difficulties, the complexities of mathematics through touch, through color. So really important basics for how we think about the studio, materiality, how we think about learning. Somebody like Sheila Hicks, this is a very early Sheila Hicks weaving, very simple weaving, warp and weft weaving going on here. I go back to her time and time again for all kinds of reasons, including being an extraordinary model, somebody who worked with Albers at Yale in the painting department and gave up painting, commanding a hierarchy of a language and moving into textiles and crafts, that which was relegated to women's work. And to see her come back in full force in the art world is extraordinary. I've learned a lot from her, and she's super generous. I spend a lot of time just listening to her. Somebody like Baldassari, thinking about boredom and temporal rhythm, something that's going on in contemporary art right now. We hear a lot of atemporality. Right? We had a whole exhibition of painting at the MoMA built around atemporality, the idea that we as artists or individuals kind of mine our own histories, right? All right, I'm not an atemporal person. I really believe in temporal rhythms and how those things come together, including the concept of boredom. Right? Being able to stretch time to a point where it affects the body, but something else happens as we cognate the world and the ideas that we live in, right? So stretching it, not to the point of ennui, in which, nothing happens and it becomes an emotional quagmire, but to the point of being able to stretch time, right? When time often stretches us. So boredom is a part of that. And then when we look at Baldassari, I will not make any more boring art, the kind of tongue-in-cheek of that, to do it again and again. Also thinking about temporality, a different kind of temporal system is on Kawara, and the day to day. What does that mean to mark the day? Meryl Euclides Latterman, somebody who's very important to me. I recently wrote a long essay on her work looking at the survey that was mounted at the Queen's Museum that I know a handful of you saw last year. Here we have her cleaning the steps at the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford in 1973. So the idea of maintenance art, right? The idea of care. She was coming to the idea of maintenance art and embedding herself in embedding herself in the everyday was happening at the same time we were actually having photographs of our Earth, that blue marble, sent back to Earth from satellites, right? And what we saw then is a need for care. Right? How does this thing sustain itself? How do we protect it? But at the same time, there was another facet, and I'm being very simplistic here, there was another facet of our population that looked at the Earth as a potential of being exploited. Right? So we have somebody who's actually thinking about taking care, whether it's her children or whether it's the museum or New York City and its boroughs. Here, this is one of my favorite pieces. It's just a still. Here we have Euclides conducting a work ballet with street sweepers, and she has been doing this since 1983 and continued to 2012. So then we have repetition as well with things that we know, but then a different kind of power, a different kind of relationship also to gender. This is Ben Kinmont. Ben Kinmont is somebody I go back to again and again. He's not that much older than I am, and I put him in the 2014 Whitney Biennial. This is a piece that's really important, and anybody who is curious again about that collapsing of the everyday should look at his work. And this is a piece, it's just a document from a piece titled, "Sometimes a Nicer Sculpture is to Provide a Living for Your Family." And what he's done is, since the mid-90s, started an antiquarian book. He's a bookseller, and he's in business, and basically how that generates and creates a revenue for his family and for his children. So really thinking very interestingly, conceptually about the everyday, and again, a kind of maintenance. Also in 1991, a piece that really affected me when I was out of school, it was titled "A Prayer for Greater Compassion in the Art World." He was working with a handful of priests in New York City at the time. So somebody that I don't think is embraced enough. His father was an important Fluxus artist, and I think sometimes Ben gets a short shrift. Okay, here we have Anna and Bernard Bluma. There was an exhibition at the Milwaukee Art Museum when I was an undergrad a long time ago in the 80s. This is the large-scale black and white photographs, and it's called Kitchen Frenzy from 1986. at MoMA in New York, this piece, and on occasion they bring it out. So you can run into it. I've run into it a couple times. It depends on what they're doing in their permanent collection. And here we have the Blumas, not to be confused with the Beckers, but the Blumas really looking at the middle class, the German middle class, and the stability of the kitchen or the stability of the potato. And for me, the image that shows that colander, that kind of fixed whole. So right now, if one just thinks back, if one thinks back to the 80s and the 90s, and one thinks about the idea of the whole is a problem, right? The idea, and I'm talking about whole with a W, right? That which is closed. It's really kind of interesting when we start thinking about new formalism that the whole is coming back. It's not kind of that Derrida taking it apart, thinking about difference, but thinking about what brings us together. And I think the colander is a really beautiful representation of that. And that's something that I've been thinking a lot about, right up there with other structures of form, repetition, as I mentioned before, network and whole, and hierarchies as well. An image by Julia Fish on the right. It's a little bit later, but Julia Fish was very important to me as a young painter here in Chicago in the early 90s. Her relationship to the everyday, abstraction and pattern, but also Christopher Wool, early Christopher Wool pattern, and also thinking a little bit here, which it's a nice contrast, these two. One understands the familiarity with the image, but also the difference between original, what is original, where's the composition, so how Julia extracts and creates a new form, right, a new understanding of pattern out of its understanding of the whole of the bathroom or the whole of that domestic situation. And Christopher Wool and his offset and what was happening there, the relationship to the new or invention, that was really impacting on me. So right out of school, I went to Northwestern. Many of you know this. I like to say it. It's getting a little tedious. I could not get into the School of the Art Institute, where I am now a professor. I tried twice in 2 different departments, and I ended up going to Northwestern. And Northwestern, Ed Paschke was there. I was working in Milwaukee. I received an MA in art history in Milwaukee, and I was working in the Center for 20th Century Studies. It was one of these hybrid programs, and Jane Gallup was there, Kathy Woodward was there. Kathy Woodward was dealing with poetry and aging. And she knew Ed well and basically picked up the phone. So I'm very thankful to her for getting back down to Chicago. But Northwestern is not the program that it is today. It really was kind of focused and pivoted around 3 important men, including Ed Paschke. And when I was there, as one does when one is the academy, in the academy, one starts thinking about things that don't necessarily translate when one gets out of the academy. I was thinking about, well, I was dealing a lot with women's representation in popular culture, looking at critically people like Lucille Ball or Mary Tyler Moore and what their representation was in the hierarchy and the power situations within sitcoms and so forth. And that's what one does when one is in the academy. I was doing a lot of deep research, and it didn't make sense when I stepped out, right? I had 2 young children when I came out of graduate school, and that didn't make sense to me, that kind of research. But what did make sense to me is the representation, a kind of higher degree of abstraction, oddly, that I remember Julia Fish coming into my studio when I was at Northwestern, showing her a representation of Lucille Ball, and she kept pointing to the background, which was a pattern, and she said, just make a painting of that pattern. And I kept thinking to myself, this is a terrible studio visit, we're wasting each other's time for you to walk away. That happens pretty regularly, but 3 years later, it rang very, very true, and I delved deep into what she was saying and how that pattern back there represents something even more powerful than the representation of something that was identifiable or had a kind of research construction around it. So I started looking at the backdrops to my everyday life, right? Curtains, paper towel patterns, blanket patterns, and again, mind you, this is late 80s, early 90s, where throughout the 80s, we really kind of purged the idea of that touch, right? Women were dealing with photographic representation. You know, there was, Schnabel was breaking pottery, but for the most part, there was a kind of breaking away from the idea of the mark, the touch of the artist. So what you're looking at here, and what I default to these paintings as indexical paintings, because basically I was taking material from my everyday and using them as indexes for a pattern. What's really important, and this is the kind of formalist tension that I was talking about earlier, is what happens with that materiality, the body of a material as it stretches over a geometry, the geometry being a panel, right? Perfectly perpendicular, perfectly flat, but then you have this material contrast that happens. So it's a dichotomous relationship between that material and the support. And then also the breakdown. So even though they're indexical, I'm still filling in either the positive or negative, and then there's the breakdown of, and then this is a grand cliche, I understand this, but the breakdown of either my hand or the material properties of the paint itself. The paint starts getting too thick. Something happens along the way. The material world always impacts the kind of degree of abstraction. Grand cliche, we've been dealing with that for a long time, but that's what's really interesting to me. It's not about originality, it's about finding difference within something that is so recognizable. So I'll just keep going through a handful of these. Again, you can see that tension. Some of them were crocheted blankets, which I'm still dealing with now. In this case, we're looking at a jute placemat. And again, you can kind of see here in this case, because of the kind of the wider openings, the kind of negative space of the jute weaving, you can kind of get a sense of that spray underneath. So you get that kind of indexical quality. This was just a big open weave. I like to bring this up because way back then, we sat on things in our car called car beads. We used to have these seats that were covered with car beads for comfort. I can't understand, but it was a very strange textile kind of pattern form, and this is the pattern that you get there. And what was happening, I was really thinking about materiality, and I was using really just hardware store brand enamel paint on panel at the time. And then I started thinking about flocking. What is the opposite? Again, I really am a dichotomous thinker. So what is the opposite of that hard, slick surface? And that is pumping flocking into wet enamel. So having a kind of a fuzzy surface that had a different kind of relationship or pull up that textile quality. So that's what you're looking at here. Again, highly recognizable as granny squares, large-scale granny squares. So I was doing that for a while, and I was getting a good deal of critical attention. And again, it just took one exhibition at the Milwaukee Art Museum. It was called Painting in the 90s, and I was with really important people to me, Galen Gerber, John Curran. It was just this big survey of painting in the 90s, and there wasn't a lot of painting going on in the 90s. So it was an honor to be there. And then in Chicago, some of you may remember the Uncomfortable Spaces. There was a Gallery 10-in-1 that picked me up because of that exhibition. So it was just this, it wasn't at all strategy, it just happened. And I was getting a lot of attention, a lot of reviews with the interpretation that the work that I was presenting, painting, had a relationship to women's work. And it does, but that really changed for me. I understood that as a kind of undercurrent of the work, but the current for me was abstraction. And thinking about order, right? Going back to that kind of formal relationship to order hierarchies, in this case, composition, that idea of the cross, securing something, making it whole. And all of this other conversation around gender seemed a bit of a red herring to me. Like, I understood it, but it was just too specific. It wasn't breaking away. And I was a young artist at that time, and let me tell you, young artists, take any kind of criticality that you can get. Don't poo-poo it, because over time it will aggregate and a truth will reveal itself. But at that point, that kind of criticism was just too much. I felt I had to make a pivot, but still take with me the same relationship to time, to repetition, but I was doing away with that index, that thing that could be a representation, right? That thing that was a granny square blanket, the thing that was a curtain. So what did I do? I went to geometry. I went to Archimedes Spirals, right? The idea of simple geometry. So what we're looking at here are canvases. It's white flash. I start in the center, and I just rotate out. And an Archimedes spiral, as some of you know, is just the arms of that spiral are always equal distance, right? So I just basically spiral my way out. Many of you have heard me talk about these works as vulgar. I find them very vulgar when they're flipped up. They have all kinds of opticality. They move around. You know, some people like that optical effect. For me, it was about recording time over long periods of time, dot by dot by dot. They're confusing to me also, and this is maybe where the vulgarity comes from, because they solicit two kinds of things out of me. One being the figure-ground relationship. So when I talk to painters and they're interested in this work, they talk about that cresting that happens. Again, that cliche, material world, you know, me spinning around and not being able to be perfect, and thus you get a crest, you get a figure-ground relationship. That is interesting when one starts thinking about paintings. But for me, my interest, again, was kind of a recording of time, right? The idea of mark by mark by mark. So you get these kind of twists that happen. You can kind of see the variation. That's, again, that's the paint evaporating. That's me getting up and leaving the studio and coming back and having a different kind of pressure in the brush the next day, or a different kind of distance between point to point to point. Right? So it records something of the physical world. And that is important to me, but as soon as I flip these things up, and we're talking about 80 inches, you know, they're pretty substantial things, they end up, I don't enjoy looking at them. I enjoy thinking about them. I enjoy the process. But, you know, clearly, aesthetically, I'm not pulled to the opticality of them. Some people are. Okay. And again, reducing it down to black and white, there was then, you know, the idea of this kind of fine motor, point by point, trying to think about another way of activating the body, both with the Archimedes Spiral, also with these silver point drawings, sometimes on paper, sometimes on panel, the idea of the unoriginal, right? I don't go to the studio and want to come up with a composition that I haven't seen before. I'm happy to take pre-existing compositions, formats, templates, and again, execute them, in this case, line by line, right? And then let other things happen. The silver points let the material world, the kind of tarnishing, the change that happens in the materiality itself, right? Sometimes it happens when maybe the straight edge slips or my hand slips a little bit, or the sharpness of the silver cuts the paper. But for the most part, the change that's happening, the uniqueness, is imprinted in the material through a kind of sulfuric change within the material. We call it tarnishing. And it changes over time. It darkens often, and it starts from the edge and moves forward. So materiality is really important. Originality in composition, it's something that doesn't interest me. It's something I'm critical of. I think about all the time. Here's a piece on silver point on panel. Here you can kind of get a sense of the scale. This is an exhibition that was at the Wexner called Gray Matter in the spring of 2017, last year. And you can get a sense of its scale by juxtaposing it with the Tobakadori or the Mona Hatum. All right, so that continued for quite some time, and what I am saying is that the indexical paintings, the silver points, even the Archimedes Spiral dot paintings, they're always in operation. Sometimes I just need to return to them for a couple months. So they're always within kind of the menu of labor and work. The indexical paintings, however, this is the work that I was talking about that had such a kind of a critical embrace around women's work that I was pushing at. I decided to rethink about that. My relationship to the home changed. You know, two of my sons have grown and moved along. You know, my daughter, I had a young daughter, but our whole situation has changed. Our relationship to domestic economy, where we live, thinking about school structure. So what does it mean to return to these backdrops? You know, these middle-class backdrops, are they interesting anymore? I don't know, I didn't know. And I kind of, there was a freedom returning to these things. So no longer was it the blanket that my young son was swaddled in, it was a blanket that I picked up at the Goodwill. Looking at pattern again, really kind of diving into form. So I'm just gonna show you a couple of these. And they were included in an exhibition I had in New York, and I wanna say this was 2014. And here's an installation, and I'll talk quickly about this installation, because I didn't quite know what to do with that return. I didn't quite know what to do with those signifiers. I didn't quite know what to do with the idea of women's work within the representation, let's say, of those textiles that look like granny square blankets that I didn't have any kind of personal attachment to, nor did I want a personal attachment to it. Returning to the work and having an exhibition in New York when I haven't quite solved that problem yet, and I stand up here and still say I still don't quite understand where those paintings are, again, in a relationship to the domestic. So what I ended up doing is configuring this big red herring, and it's not red at all, but it's this thing that hangs in the middle of the gallery, right? So working with my husband, we have this large mobile that kind of moves and circulates over this platform of those paper weavings I was showing you. And on the other side of this hanging mobile, you see this steel T that shoots out, and we have a concrete a cast of my daughter's chair, her little art table that's in the studio, then a large photograph that swings on there like a bangle of my family and my 3 children and my husband in the garden up in Wisconsin. And it's all kind of sitting there. So this is that story, that thing I don't like to talk about, right? This is that thing that tells you when you come in there that there is Michelle, and she is domestic, and she has children, and she is also a painter, and there's these garbage can lids that are hammered out to make this kind of scallop shape. And I call these hanging things my oyster, right? The idea that, the world is my oyster, and this is it. So I hung this thing in there because I really wanted to draw attention away from the paintings. I needed to protect those paintings because I don't understand them yet. Right? And I do understand, telling a good story in Chelsea is all right. One can handle that, right? Especially one about a Midwestern woman who is, as Ken Johnson called me, a soccer mom. So some of you may remember this review that came out in the New York Times about this show, and it was a disaster. It took me a couple days to get out of bed, but he did call me a soccer mom. I talked the gallery into, and God bless them for listening to artists, but against my best wishes, or best interest, to also at the entrance have a video made by the artist David Robbins, in which he tracks me at my rural studio, baking pies, doing paper weaving. It was meant to be ironic. Ken Johnson didn't see it that way. He thought it was just a little descriptor of who I am and what I do. So it worked. The man didn't say anything about the paintings. He really didn't even say anything about this work. He just was going on about the privilege of being a Midwestern soccer mom. So, playing with perceptions, right? We're a storytelling culture. We're always on edge for what Netflix is putting out next. I am. So it's important to play that. And then that will allow you the time you need to think through things critically, come to understand them, but also work within the realities, in this case, of a commercial gallery and economic system. That is another reality that we all deal with. But in my I don't know, it was harsh. I ended up designing a soccer ball. None of my children play soccer, so I'm not a soccer mom. Yes, so I worked with Thing Company in San Francisco to produce the soccer ball in honor of Ken Johnson. I'm going to walk you through some installation shots, and we'll look at some details, and then we'll go through some processes, some sculptural processes. This is the installation at the Indianapolis Museum of Art. This is a very large platform of paper weavings. Again, thinking about how do I re-enter them, going back to the Charles Demuth, thinking about painting, thinking about painting's authority. What does it mean to translate these paper patterns into painting? This is a recent exhibition in New York, well, last year, I should say, 2000, I want to say December, January of last year, not this year, in which I started working on these bronzes, and I'll walk you through these bronzes and these large gingham pattern paintings. Here's a detail. These are half-inch gingham, and I'll talk a little bit about gingham. Gingham is interesting to me because it does break down into a kind of cliche. It's one of these things that is portable, right? It moves through not only history, but it moves through class. Right? So it started out as a kind of fabric, a pattern in which laborers would use when they were entering into the factories in the UK, in England a long time ago. But also we see that now, right? We start seeing, I'm sure some of you even have gingham on. So you start looking at it in the turn of the century also when one thinks about bourgeois still life. So here we have Bonnard, here we have Matisse. This is from 1903. It's interesting because gingham doesn't translate into French. It's always called red check, but it's solidly gingham. So thinking about the idea of gingham, thinking about abstraction, right? It's a simple weave, it's 2 colors, and we're looking at a grid structure. And if we can pull it out of a kind of social relationship to this movement of pattern through class structures, what's happening at Target has used gingham for their summer launch, or boutiques. So it really keeps moving around as, again, this very simple pattern, but to actually challenge us to look at it and think about it in terms of abstraction and repetition. What's interesting to me, or what I was thinking about, is a kind of tooth, and I'll show you a detail. Maybe you can see it here. When I was showing you the Archimedes paintings, the point paintings, black and white for the most part, looking at the silver points, black and white. When I was teaching at Skowhegan in the summer of 2015, was really looking a lot at Marston Hartley, a Mainer, and going to looking at his studio. How was he using oil paint? Oil paint I haven't used since I was an undergrad in college. I was always using water-based material, so thinking about what this greasy stuff is, what can happen here with translucency, with transparency, and also thinking about color and thinking about Elbers, right? So what is the underpainting? What is the complementary? How can you start to activate these gingham patterns? So I'm just going to walk you through, the scale. I think the long is 108 inches, something like that, 90 by 108. And here's some installation shots. So it's a funny thing. It's still a funny show for me. Where I felt very much in control with that first exhibition. This exhibition, 18 months later, is a funny thing when one deals with hard edge grid and the collapse of the material body. And I'm just going to I'll walk you through where those bronzes came from in a bit and how they're related and how I landed on them. And I'll just walk you through some of these ginghams. All right, an indexical painting, one of the new indexical paintings. All right, so this is how I get their pattern, right? So you see these textiles, these domestic textiles. I spray through them, I get that index, then I have this crusty thing, right? This thing, and I have hundreds of them. And when I recently made the move from Oak Park to Fox Point, which is Milwaukee, where I live now, I had to move these things, and I had to figure out what I'm going to do with them. And it was an ethical question, right? They gave over their pattern to painting. You can't really use them more than once because they clot up in their negative force. So what if I make them, what if I commit them to, in this case, bronze, right? If I lose them through a burnt wax process. So I would take these blankets, I would dip them in wax. The wax would become hard. The wax then, these big waxed textiles get cut up in the bandsaw. Sprues are attached. A ceramic shell is made, and bronze is poured into them. But before bronze is poured in, the ceramic shell has to burn out that textile. So the textile no longer exists, right? We have this kind of hollow form in which bronze takes that form. So what is happening when I'm dipping these textiles in wax? It's a labor-intensive process, as you can see. However, it's very fast for me, right? It's almost like a charcoal drawing. It's taking these things, it's dipping them, it's hanging them up, right? And then the process begins, but it's not, it really is just a kind of commemorating of the thing itself. Here we have them having to be welded back together, moved around, a base set up. And here's a detail. So that's the process that's going on. So starting to think about a kind of ethical relationship to that which you used in a different, you used at one point in these paintings, but now giving them over to a kind of body, a kind of collapsing body, that kind of weight that happens. And I'll show you another one here. Some of them collapse onto the ground. For the most part, they're not much taller than as high as I could reach. A handful. And then also thinking about metal. There's a lot of freedom, as many of you know, when one swings into a material processee that one hasn't had a long, slugged-out relationship with. So all of a sudden, pouring brass, pouring bronze, pouring iron, you can do anything you want. You can try it, right? So to some degree, it's a little bit like drawing, except again, the process is laborious. And in this case, thinking about those things again that populate our or cupboards, and these are aluminum pans. And it was Gallery 400, probably in 91. B. Wirtz, before B. Wirtz, now we all know who B. Wirtz was. There was a long period of time where nobody knew who B was. And B was taking these aluminum pans, these disposable aluminum pans, and painting, making these abstractions on the back of them, and then hanging them on the wall. I think it's really, again, a kind of criticality, but a kind of volley. We see this volley in Europe all the time, right, with artists. You talk to Albert, and there's this kind of back and forth, thinking about what Polka was doing. There's this kind of push and pull. Here we have a different kind of relationship to originality and invention. We don't do that as often. And let me tell you, people take offense. People will think about the idea of copying. But in this case, it really is an homage, thinking about what B taught me about a domestic, disposable material and thinking about casting it solid. Last fall, I was very lucky to take part of the Art and Industry program at the Kohler up in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. It's actually a town called Kohler. And I was able to cast brass because we know perfectly well Kohler creates porcelain, they create our tubs, our toilets, but they also create those fixtures, and those fixtures are made of brass and then plated. So we're looking at some really large-scale brass work. And then what's happening here is the process that I'm using, it's what we call a bonded sand mold, which is very different, that the material itself never gets burned away, so I can use it again and again. So what this is again, a pattern, a textile that already gave its, I'll explain to you, already created this iron pattern. So what you're looking at here is a 40 by 40 inch, I consider them relief paintings, but they're iron and they weigh about 400 pounds. But again, they're documenting in the same way that the indexical paintings are, they create that tension between geometry and the body of the index, the material body. I'm also thinking a lot about rust. Thank you, Rosemary Trockle. This is a really beautiful piece called Copy Me. Trockle is somebody I go to again and again. It's at MoMA. Those are the guards humoring me in the back. But Copy Me is an interesting piece because it's her way of, again, challenging the idea of originality, recreating something. So half of it is a cast of a couch and the other half is she made the couch in a kind of verisimilitude of the extended couch. So it's unusually long. She does this really amazing gesture of putting the plastic over it, just incredible. Again, speaking to class, speaking to originality, thinking about preservation. But it's that rust, right? So, thinking about rust as orange. How do you formalize it so it doesn't trip out of, it doesn't immediately talk to something of the past? So that's what I'm thinking of. Just in this case, this is in the Kohler Foundry. These are the molds I have to make for those large-scale relief iron paintings. And you can see the textile. I pull then that textile out, I fold it, and then cast it again as that first brass piece. This is the cope and the drag put together. And here's just some other kind of domestic elements that I was making at the Kohler. This is an iron piece that I patinaed black that supports marbles. This is just, again, a Froebel-esque exercise of what is shiny, what is flat, what is round, what is irregular, what is a pattern, what starts to break away. So still thinking about Froebel and thinking about how we come to understand the world through these kind of haptic exercises. This is a brass aluminum pan. Again, it's solid. And this is a pretty accurate image of how I can actually get that rust. So making it orange, not that ruddy rust, but that kind of really beautiful flocky feel that brings me back to those flock paintings I was talking about earlier. The John McKinnon, who is here and who's now the director of the Elmhurst Art Museum, invited me to participate in this house. And this piece, this brass piece that you're looking at, is included, as are a couple other heavy brass pieces. I put my foot in there. I haven't taken photographs of the installation yet. Put my foot in there for scale. But you get a sense that these things are a couple 100 pounds because they're solid. John sent me this. I hope you don't mind, John. A little sneak peek of the McCormick House, in which I had curtains. I was making curtains for one of the glass walls. So I hope you all come out to see it. It's an interesting group show. I included Jim Welling, Tony Tassett's. I should have brought in Tony's work early on, his domestic abstractions that he was working on in the late 80s. Late 80s. I was looking at those, thinking about, again, that kind of line between representation and abstraction, again, the hierarchy of painting and those materials that he was using. Paula Crown is also included, and who am I missing, John? Is there somebody else, Tony? That may be it. Anyways, join us. And before I move on to these curatorial projects, which I'm going to whip through, and it's more of a way of getting you enthused about coming to Cleveland next summer, I want you to think about interpretation. I teach two seminar classes coming up in the spring, and I think a lot about critique and interpretation. And there's really interesting things going on in post-critique right now, how we think about interpreting things. But we also live in a world, how many of us talk about transaction or the transactional exchange that happens, right? So, for instance, if we're thinking about the Met changing its admission policy, what's happening is a kind of transaction. And in that transaction, we consume or we take in language. We don't feel as free to interpret. So I really do think we're living at this really problematic time in which these kind of transactional relationships to the world are really tapping down our ability to think differently and think about critique. So anyways, I will leave you with that. That's something I'm thinking about as I'm starting to develop reading lists and so forth. But I'm going to whip back. How are we doing on time? Where's my guy up there? Who's going to flash? Got a couple minutes? Yeah? Well, deal with me. Okay, the Suburban. The Suburban was running for 15 plus years in Oak Park. Oak Park now has a vibrant art scene, as I hear. What I'm showing you here is Andrea Sittel's smock shop. She decided not to use the proper exhibition space out in the suburbs, the suburban space, instead to use the house, and she sent some smockers out, and she transformed the house into a kind of a shop. Just to remind you a little bit of some of the suburban projects, here we have Jean Dunning. This was the 2008 presidential election. She created this inflatable thumb. I know it doesn't look like a thumb, but it is. Trust me, there's a nail on the back side. So it's that civic thumbs up, and then we have Kay Rosen project on the inside and on the door. Tony Fair. Tony Fair, after coming back from Istanbul, was really inspired by Islamic stained glass, and this kind of kicked off this work that we know really well now. Spent a handful of time making compositions in the window of the Suburban. As Tony's work, and he's somebody else, obviously, who's been really important to me, and a great loss that he's not here anymore. But these compositions, are not easy. He would often spend a day making compositions, taking them down, and doing it again. Also thinking about the Suburban as an extension of a kind of pedagogy, having my grad students at the time, Molly Zuckerman Hartung and Dana DeGulio, come in and work with Katerina Grossa, work on mixing the paint, this paint that would actually flow through her airbrush. She was out there. This is Walid Beshti and his FedEx boxes and some welling in the background. And many of you know the Suburban has been built many, many, many times over. There's one that's actually circulating through the South right now at universities in the Southeast, which delights me. And then what happens in these exhibition spaces, I'm still putting forward artists. In this case, it was my survey exhibition at MoCA Cleveland that David Norr curated, and inside I believe that is Carl Handel. But the Suburban now, we've moved out of Oak Park, and the Suburban is here in Milwaukee. It's on the corner of Locust Street and Fratney. It's on that first floor, and then there's 2 apartments for artists who come and stay and visit and make exhibition. The exhibition you're looking at in there is Polly Applebaum and Stephen Westfall. Some of you also know that my husband and I run the Poor Farm. It's an exhibition space and a kind of residency, even though we don't formally address it that way. If you have a good reason to be there, we try to say yes. If you're a graduate sculpture department at the University of Minnesota who wants to spend a couple weeks there in March, knock yourself out. So we try to make it available to people. A couple exhibitions. This is Oliver Mosé. And something that I'm very proud of that the Poor Farm put together, including a publication, is really looking at and pulling on the archives of somebody who New York should have done. But this is the beautiful thing about living in the Midwest, I always underscore it, is that having this distance allows us to see blind spots in the center. And Gretchen Bender created what she called these television performances in the 80s. She was partner with Robert Longo at the time. This is a piece called Total Recall. It was made in 1987 for the kitchen. It was performed at the kitchen. And she died in 2004, and Steve Sherman and Robert Longo basically went through her archive, sent a lot of it down to a very, boxed it up, these big old beta tapes, boxed it up, sent it to a small museum in North Carolina. And we basically transferred all of that. We were able to get a hold of it, put together an exhibition, a catalog, give her a kind of context, and send this work right back to the kitchen in New York. So it's kind of the beautiful thing about being here. One can actually see that which is overlooked. My light is flashing. She also, just a quick reminder, she also did the credits for, some of us remember, America's Most Wanted. If you go up right now, you'll see Monique Prieto and her husband, Michael Webster, both LA-based artists. They took over the Poor Farm last summer. Quick walkthrough. I won't say anything. I'm just going to walk through. This is old news. This is the 2014 biennial where this is my floor. Some of you will remember it. There was controversy. I included David Foster Wallace's notebooks. David Foster Wallace I return to again and again because he helps me think through ideas, cliche, attention, and so forth. I keep going back to how he thinks about and how he's moved over his career. Tony Tassett's Artist Monument. Working on, so that, you know, the Whitney Biennial is the Whitney Biennial. It's a national exhibition. You know, what is America? That's a question we always think about. Then I was asked to come and curate the Oregon Biennial. It's actually called the Portland Biennial, but it's a statewide biennial. Traveling around the state and coming to understand the power of regionalism, something that I still hang on to and think about, what is that now? One of the highlights of that biennial was to offer an alum of SAIC, somebody I worked with very early on in the 90s when I first started teaching here, Jessica Jackson Hutchins. So as a curator, what's important to me is I'm an artist, obviously, and when I take on curatorial positions, it's really taking on a position to offer an artist a different set of conditions in which they may learn something, they may not, but the idea of setting something forward. So Jessica Jackson Hutchins, a well-known artist in Portland, sending her out to Pendleton and to work in now abandoned Christian Science reading room in which some stained glass was broken out of the ceiling, and she started working in glass as a result of it. So that is kind of the perfect example. If my curatorial work can actually lead artists down a different path, I have succeeded. So I continue to do that, and I continue to do that with Front International. This is a triennial exhibition. It's the first of it's the very first to open up in July of 2018, and it is occupying a handful of institutions and not such conventional spaces. This is the Allen Memorial Gallery, in which Barbara Bloom, the New York artist Barbara Bloom, is taking on a new project actually in the gallery that Venturi built. It's kind of an add-on in the back. Here in Oberlin, and also Juan Oroja, he's working in the Frank Lloyd Wright Usonian House that also is part of Oberlin's campus. It's off campus, but it's part of Oberlin's property. The Cleveland Museum of Art, we're looking at Alan Ruppersberg, Louisa Lambree, Callie Spooner, Carrie James Marshall, among others, will occupy spaces within the Cleveland Museum of Art. MoCA Cleveland, it's not a collecting institution, but it's kind of spectacular in its architecture. Right now we're working with Cyprien Guillard, Martine Sims, and Josh Klein, and others. I'm still working out some other projects. And in this space, it would be to your left, Tony Tassett. We commissioned Tony Tassett to do a big work in what we call Toby's Plaza. Here we have an old warship called the Mather. We're mounting an Alan Sekula exhibition here within the hull of the ship. The public library, we're working on a Yinka Shonibara project. Federal Reserve is across the street, a young artist, Phil Vanderheiden, Playhouse Square, Candy Sprites. Here we have, it's an etching of St. John's Church. We have Dawood Bey, who's been working in Cleveland on a new series of photographs that look at the Underground Railroad and its, the terminus of the Underground Railroad in Cleveland, so that's a whole new series. You know, if you're thinking about doing a road trip next summer, I encourage you to come to Cleveland. It really is it's a far-reaching project. It also includes Akron as well. Okay. Thank you. I want to take questions, though, but yes. Thank you. Please. Oh, yes, yes. Hey, Tony.
You said two things about criticality. One was that my work is critical. Don't forget that. You sort of started that way. Yeah. And then you also said, you know, there's a lot of talk now. I mean, there's a couple of books about being in this new period of a different kind of not critical, right? Period that we're in, or
yeah, it's called post-critical, and let me recommend Rita Felski. Rita Felski, it's literary. It's literary criticism is my guide always. It's always the first, and it was the first that pulled us into affect, which you know we're moving out of. But Rita Felski, University of Pennsylvania, has Beyond Critique. Again, all the sources are always literary, so we have to do this great translation, which I really enjoy when one takes a piece of literature and tries to find the equivalent in the visual arts. But when post-critical is a tricky thing because it's not, criticality is still there, it just takes new forms, right? So the French right now are liking a form of criticality, and what is it? I'm not going to translate it right, but it's about generosity, right? It's just muchness, right? Or there's excessive criticality, that's the Zizek overly explanation, right? Or it's the deep reading, it's the cross reading. So there's really interesting forms going on. You know, the question is, what form do you use when one is looking at a public sculpture? What is the, you know, and ideally, I'm of the position where it's multiple voices, multiple kinds of interpretations. You know, where was I recently? Maybe I was just teaching in New York, and there were a handful of artists who, again, you know, really will make active measures to make sure that interpretation, their understanding of the work is interpreted correctly. I think that's a fool's game. You'll spend all of your time trying to make corrections, and you know, I think the best we can learn, the best we can like roll our eyes. You know, the Ken Johnson, I don't know what to do with that except make a soccer ball. You know, it's not really changing much. It was just false, but it also, yeah. Is that kind of helpful?
There's a Pamela Fraser has a book out that just came out about post. I haven't really read that much.
I wrote the blurb in the back of the book.
Yeah. Okay.
Following up, because this will give everybody a chance to come up with another question. Rita Felski, there's an anthology that I just picked up that I'm going to use in class. I'll send it to you. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
First of all, thank you. My God, what an illuminating talk. And so many references for us to think about and sort of chew on. And so my question will also be equally referential, I think. So I'm going to need your help perhaps a little bit. But it takes me back to, yes, this one. The painting that you also come back to in this house. And something that you said really piqued my sort of interest, this sort of in this, you know, seemingly abstract work, this aspect of realness, let's say. And, you know, in this house, we close a show on Sunday, Revolution demonstration. I won't embarrass myself in sort of explaining it in Russian. But what was beautiful about that show, you shot that moment in Russian history when sort of the revolution was, of course, instigating all these new forms in art, mostly sort of abstraction. abstraction. But very soon after that, sort of the Soviet Union went into a period of social realism. And of course, the history of art in the 20th century sort of has these oppositional forces, if you will, with sort of abstraction on the one hand and figurative art or realness or realism or whatever term you want to use for it. And basically my question, if anything, is an invitation for you to maybe reflect in your work on the relationship between sort of abstraction on the one hand, because your work could be deemed as such, but also social critique and maybe a re-estimation of what social realism can be in that sense.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I've been spending a lot of time looking at American trompe-l'oeil painting, right? So again, a kind of value system. I'm going to skirt around that question just because these are things that I'm thinking about. So one is genre. So that's not talking about realism, but how genre can work. Because if genre is anything like the idea of form as a whole, genre is nothing but agreement. Right? We can agree that this is a sci-fi, right? So how can we use genre right now? And there's a lot of interesting genre theory that's happening that I've been thinking about. And as a matter of fact, I'm putting together some exhibitions around genre right now. But back to maybe the artist response to that question is about how it's the time frame that you're talking about, right? So I even, I'm old, and I'm able to see now 3 decades of work where the kind of, I don't want to say it's the same relationship. I make pivots, material pivots. The world changes how I see and understand things. But it's also really interesting to see a kind of relationship to work that falls in and out of influence, right? And I try not to over-anticipate responding immediately to the conditions of the world. So if we go back to the Muth, right? I mean, we're just dealing with right now, the ideas around truth, right? Or where is it? It wasn't too long ago I wrote a long essay on, Prince. Prince left. We don't even talk about Prince, Richard Prince. I'm talking about when we start thinking about. The issues that were coming out of the State House or the White House or whatever the conditions are, right? I mean, he looks antiquated, despite moving into Bitcoin or whatever his new monetary system is. So I think it's okay when it's out of time. It doesn't have to be a pivot or a sink in relationship to representation or abstraction. But to be patient with it. And one can actually see it maybe fall into place and fall out of place, fall in and out of step. And then you have to ask yourself, why is that? Is it the language? Is it me? Is it my understanding of the world, my interpretation? So I think, if there's one, it's so excellent being mid-career and older, just because one understands that there is this temporal relationship to those questions that you're asking. But I don't think I hit it exactly. Again, like I said, I think I didn't hit that question. Oh, okay. Thanks.
Looking at this painting, do you have a position on taking these ordinary things and putting them on a gallery or a museum wall? Is it elevation? Is it something that is meaningful to you to take these out of context?
Yes and no. I think with this, it's less of what it is as samples. I mean, look at those samples. I mean, they're pretty abstract for the most part. I mean, some of them look kind of quaint, perhaps, as pattern, but some of them are just grid structures, right, for the most part, and we're dealing with color. For me, it's kind of the struggle with what I was saying, the relationship between abstraction, look at that ground, and representation, the need to record what is being observed, and truthfully at that, by including things that do not necessarily make it a better painting. And I can say that now, right? But this goes back to the question that maybe that kind of representation, that inclusion of all those details, including that little corner sneaking out from behind this kind of overlay, was terribly important at the time. This is an anomaly. I'm not at all an early American abstract scholar, but it's my understanding that this is a little atypical for his work in terms of subject matter.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Q.
Can you talk a little bit about failure? There's like an early article where you sort of pushed back against the whole Beckett fail, fail again, fail more, fail better. And then like in your latest like Bomb magazine interview, you sort of like mentioned failure and kind of pushing against this institutional embracing of failure. So you could take it in either direction, failure sort of outside and institutional, like what does that look like? But I guess I'm more interested in your framework of failure. Like what does that framework look like, and how would you define that in terms of your own practice or even curatorial practice?
Yeah, and I think it depends on where you find me, right? And if you find me in the studio ethically, I am built to struggle through failure. That I will not, if it fails, it will not come to the public. I will do it again and again and again, and I will not bring failure to a public. I will not embrace it, and this is tricky, but it just goes back to kind of a middle class ethos that was embedded. So that's this. In the classroom, I think I'm much more pliable with it. The Bomb interview with Anoka Faruqi that you're talking about, Anoka brought up something that she's such a smart person. She talked about failure being so problematic right now, particularly when we're thinking about public schools and who can fail, right? Who's failing and who's not failing, and laying a politic over that. Where I think when we talk about failure in the classroom, it's it's exploration, right? I do this thing. Who was I talking to? Judith Bernstein. I was talking to somebody in New York recently about just that kind of failure. But we're talking about it differently. I consider it drawing, right? The drawing that I can kind of, and whether that's, casting metal or if that is, photography or some glass work that I'm doing, I do this thing. And again, this is the dichotomous person in me, and dichotomies can be dangerous, but I also understand how they can work to help me again think critically, and that is there is painting. Painting has and takes and commands a kind of hierarchy. We all wink wink when we say that, right? But I like to play that game, like give it its power that it keeps wanting. And then I have this other stuff I consider drawing, right? And just by the fact I execute it, I'm not really good with plate glass or fusing glass, but I really am kind of enjoying it. That's my drawing. So there's something else that's being gleaned there. I'm not calling it failure though. And I think, although Anoka could bring it to my attention, I think maybe that is what you're talking about, my pushing back on that is kind of embedded in something's wrong. It's not the right word. I understand its application or the potential application for learning, but I don't, it's this thing where, and mind you, before I taught high school for a long time before I got a tenure-track job at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. That's a whole other crazy story. But I was teaching high school full-time, and I remember sitting in these curriculum meetings talking about, giving, what does an A mean? What does a B mean? What does a C mean? What does a D mean? What does an F mean? And I just found it repugnant that we were defining D. Like we should not, a D is unacceptable, right? So why would we give a definition to what is a D or what is failure? Why should we talk about what fails, what doesn't come in, what doesn't develop, right? So it's that kind of relationship to, it's just me being an old progressive, I think. Maybe that's the way I'll define it, but yeah, I'm still muddled around that word.
Is it on? You were talking about a show in which you felt like maybe uncomfortable with not having a fully fleshed out thing to say about the patterns that you were abstracting. Like I know these are signifiers, but I don't know what to do with them. Isn't that sometimes, like maybe to you, do you think that's sometimes more important to be able to unsettle something and not really to be able to look and point at something and show it and say, I don't know exactly what this is doing or what to do with it, but I know it's something big and like important. Mm-hmm. And as a curator, do you have a preference for work that kind of seeks to answer or seeks to like pose those questions and unsettle things?
Yeah, those are two interesting questions. That show that I was talking about where I was protecting the paintings, they were still on the wall. I did put them, I saw them, and I could have conversations with, my dear deep audience of maybe 20 painters in New York. Like that is my audience. And I could have that conversation, but they were also kind of, you know, I don't know, like I said, I was talking about that red herring. But the question about curating, I think, is an interesting one. And you know, and again, I trust artists. You know, I try not to select if I don't have to, right? I mean, if it's a condition in which I have to go to a studio and I have to pick out, you know, 4 paintings for this, you know, location and this institution, I can do that. But I really trust that artists know what they need to do, right? Need the show. And if it's something that, you know, they're uncomfortable with, this may be the right opportunity to kind of come around to that or think that through. You know, in some cases, artists are just very professional about it. They need to get this work out there. That is fine too. That is a reality, and I let that happen. So that is how I move forward in curating. It is interesting. I have to tell you, this front exhibition, where, you know, 70 plus artists in many, many different kinds of spaces. Barry Schwabsky told me a couple days ago, he did this divide, and you know, I think we all know this, but he said it clearly, and I'm not going to be clear about it, but he said there's kind of 2 systems, right? There's 2 systems in this art world that we're dealing with, and there's you know, the gallery critic world of things. That's me, you know, that's the work that I was showing you. I engage in that. And then there's, you know, I was talking about Naim and these storytellers, these things that you see at Documenta in Venice, right? This work that slips around, you know, made for these kinds of exhibitions. And I realized that, you know, struggling with not so much with the Whitney Biennial. I made a show of things, of objects, of materiality. I stand by that. But this was a big project that I started working on with Jens Hoffman, who's no longer an artistic director. And this is a curator who moves fast and loose in the curatorial world. And he has a great command of that kind of artwork, that international artwork that moves from biennial to triennial to biennial. And I realized now that he's no longer there, that I'm still, you know, obliged to move forward with a lot of these artists, that there's this kind of interesting balance that I have to create now, instead of just defaulting to what I feel that I know, which I think is strong in these contexts, but also learning and dealing with that, you know, that narrative-based, storytelling, media-based work as well. So kind of blending it. So that's you know, I would say that maybe curatorially I'm trying to come to terms with what that means. That was an answer that beyond a question. Somebody's doing tea, but maybe one more question, and then somebody's, yeah.
Yeah. As I watched the slides, I was noting some of the work you did at Kohler, which was interesting because it struck me as being very three-dimensional, very related, maybe sensual in a way. And there was something about perhaps working with the material and the technology that was available to you that seemed like it changed the frame of the way that you were creating things. I wonder if you want to comment on that experience.
Yeah. You know, it was funny moving in there. I mean, it's such a physical environment, right? It's a culture of men on that plant floor. Like how I had to negotiate that first month, not only kind of learning a new process, but a new culture, quite honestly, was interesting. And I realized that that's going to be enough. Like I'll just step out of here with some trinkets, some brass little something, and I'll be okay. And then it, you know, when you're moving around a plant that has, you know, tubs on lines, or sinks, just hundreds of them, you start to think very differently about repetition, productiveness, like how one is productive. So then kind of quickly I pivoted to, all right, honing in on 1 or 2 forms and going and seeing what that is. You know, it's a hard thing to articulate, but what you're asking is actually really threaded through how I think about work in general, and I tried to explain it a little bit, but like the work is slow. Like I like limitations. I like working in striking limitations and finding and identifying difference within there. So I pulled out of the Kohler just starting to come to terms with some systems that I could work through. Maybe they'll invite me back. It doesn't always happen, but fingers crossed. But yeah, so that's the frustrating thing, and I know many of you do residencies that are medium specific, and that is always the frustration. There's a franticness that happens exactly a month before you leave, when it really is profound in the body and in thinking, and it's a frenzy that happens in one's head because you know your time is out, but you know you're just coming to that system. So maybe I need to make a disclaimer that there's a lot of unique things happening. I can tell you that I'll have an exhibition in the fall of some of the big iron relief works in New York, which I'm excited about. Got to get them that right orange. So now I'm dealing with patinas. That's dreadful, but thanks for the question. Maybe one more?
So your bronze pieces, the ones that you were talking about with reference to you and
Hello, good evening, yeah. So there's this, my first question is that you take these old objects and upcycle them.
Yeah.
Do you know the history or the story about those pieces?
Not for the majority of them, I have to say no. They mostly are culled from Goodwills throughout northern Wisconsin. There's heaps of them. I can tell you some Goodwills take on, it looks like it's an activity that is taught at some kind of community center because they're always the same in some cases. So you can kind of project into the social kind of behind of where these things are coming from. My parents in their retirement work at what is it we call St. Vinny's, and they're always hoarding them for me. They're always just making bits of them. And sometimes they do. Sometimes my mother will give me things that she was making as well. So, now I have no relationship to them. Early on, though, I did. Like I said, they were all coming from things that I've lived with that had a kind of meaningfulness and touched, the bodies in our household. And now I see them purely as pattern, a kind of labor that can be measured. But no, there's a total abstraction of whose hand is making
so then how will you title them, like for your New York show?
I'm a pain in the ass to everybody I work with. Everything is untitled. Okay, thank you, everybody.